Time traveling in Animal Crossing is something that's existed since the very beginning of the franchise history, but also has been a very contentious topic amongst many fans. Typically speaking, the game is intended to be played on a day-to-day basis, matching the real-world clock as you play through the game. However, some fans want to play through the game at a faster rate and will time travel by changing the game's clock ahead to progress faster along than waiting for the real-world time. This has always led to two different schools of thought when it comes to time traveling. Some people think it's cheating, and some people think it's just playing the game however you want to play it. Personally, I typically feel like the game is best enjoyed on the regular day-to-day basis in your beginning experience with the game, and then once you've kind of done everything that the game has to offer, like pay all your debt and get your island to 5 stars or whatever, time traveling to help ease the process of moving buildings around, ordering more than 5 items a day to decorate some idea you came up with, it's all fair game. It's better to time travel than get bored of your game and put it down altogether anyways. Though ultimately I don't really care how other people choose to play through their games. But there have always been consequences to time traveling and various different effects of time traveling throughout the years that have changed from game to game. There's also limits in what years are actually playable in each Animal Crossing game that seems to be different for each title, meaning that at some point, eventually, your Animal Crossing game will no longer work with the real time, essentially making it the end of time in each Animal Crossing title. So we're looking at every Animal Crossing game and we're gonna figure out what is the nuanced parts of time travel in each of these games and what came with having to time travel and what some of the consequences were. First, we'll go to Animal Forest for the Nintendo 64, which originally released only in Japan, though there have been fan-made translations that have been put on reproduction carts that do exist out there. Now, many of you know that Animal Forest for the N64 plays pretty much exactly like the GameCube version, though the GameCube version has more features and whatnot. Here's the really interesting thing about Animal Forest though. Unlike the GameCube, the Nintendo 64 did not have an internal clock keeping track of the real-world time. So in order to have Animal Forest sync up to the real-world time, there was actually a little battery on a clock chip inside of the game cartridge that would keep track of the time for the game. This is a lot like what was used in Pokemon Gold and Silver back in the day on the Game Boy Color. However, since these are actual batteries on the board themselves, it means that over time they eventually can run dry, and that would stop the clock in Animal Forest from working. Now, something that's completely unique to Animal Forest on the Nintendo 64 is that it has a failsafe built into the game if your battery ran dry. YouTuber Mad Little Pixel does a lot of work with the translated reproduction versions of Animal Forest and actually captured the translation of what happened, but instead you actually get introduced to KK Slider at the beginning of the game and acknowledges the fact that the clock is not working correctly, and while you can continue the game, he'll actually ask you to set the clock manually, and I assume this would happen every single time you boot up the game, so the game could continue to work the way that it's kind of intended as long as you were willing to set the clock to the real world time every single time. It is really interesting to think that there was an Animal Crossing game that had a failsafe built in that would allow you to manually set the clock every single time as needed to at least be able to continue to enjoy your game, but this also shows why there was a necessity, at least in the very beginning, for there to be the ability to manually change the clock. These clocks across the franchise are susceptible to get off sync sometimes, and I think it was always in Nintendo's best interest to allow the option to reset the clock and change things, even if it means that it can be also used to manipulate things in the game and, you know, kind of move things along faster. Moving forward, the GameCube version didn't actually need the failsafe because the GameCube could keep track of time, but if it got off sync, you could at least set it and time would continue to progress normally. Now, in Animal Crossing, there's always been punishments for players who go way too fast through the time traveling process. Surely, you can time travel one day at a time and have pretty much no massive effects on your in-game experience. However, if you decide to leap seasons, months, or even years ahead, things will start to change in your town because of this. The first generation of Animal Crossing games really hit players hard with weeds if you were skipping long periods of time. This would be whether you played the game and jumped ahead in time, or maybe you took a break for a long period of time and came back. There's gonna be weeds all over the place. If you time traveled too far forward and you had turnips, they can rot, and that can ruin your whole turnip game if that's what you're grinding for. And likely the longer times that you time travel forward, many of your villagers may have already moved out by the time you slow down your travels. Now, interestingly enough, there is a hard limit on how far you can time travel in the future in most Animal Crossing games. For the original GameCube version, they set the year at 2030, which nowadays is interesting because that's just like like a few years from now. And this one's really interesting because we've even gone ahead to look at what happens in 2030, and it seems like at that New Year's moment, the time will click over to 2031. If you go make a post on the bulletin board, you can make a post from January 1st, 2031. However, when you restart your game, you will load in on January 1st, 2030, which is interesting because it's like you're in an endless loop of the same year repeating itself over and over again. Moving forward to Animal Crossing on the Nintendo DS. Oh boy, did this game take things a step further, specifically when it came to weeds. Not only would you get some weeds if you time traveled, but your island would be completely covered in weeds. We've talked about this a lot on this channel, so we won't go too much more into what goes on with your town in this regard in Animal Crossing. But the big problem with Animal Crossing Wild World was the fact that the debt in that game was super expensive compared to how quickly you could earn bells, and then built right into the game mechanics. All you have to do is just talk on the phone in the game to access the clock, so time traveling was easier than ever. There was a savings interest account that could earn you a ton of bells practically instantly with just a couple minutes of time traveling, which made it incredibly tempting for players, almost too tempting with how slow the game goes when it comes to earning bells. Essentially, each month the post office will give you 10% of whatever money you've left in your savings account in the game. So players found if they just put like all of their money in their savings account, time travel to the year 2099, the highest date that you can time travel to, they would get multiple checks for pretty high interest amounts. Then they could redeposit that in their savings account, go back in time to the actual date, and then just move the clock forward like a year at a time. And pretty much in just a couple of minutes of doing this, you could have millions and millions of bells in your account. Now, of course, doing this would result in your town looking like an absolute mess. There may be a couple of villagers still there from your original date, but a lot of them definitely moved. And there's no easy way to clean up your town, so you're gonna have to do it all manually. But yeah, the DS version made things very easy to do. Now, interestingly enough, in this game, if you play all the way until 2099, or you time travel 2099 and stick around on New Year's, after the clock hits midnight, the date will actually revert all the way back to the year 2000, which is interesting because that's like 5 years before the game even released. But yeah, there you go. Animal Crossing City Folk works mostly the same way as Animal Crossing Wild World, except the maximum day is way shorter than what Wild World would allow for. In this game, the furthest you could travel forward in time was to the year 2035, which is just 4 years later than the Gamecube version, before the clock would reset, bringing things all the way back to the year 2000 once again. Now, it is interesting, this game came out at the end of 2008 in the US, though if you've time traveled back in time and you've been playing through the game at an earlier date, during the New Year's events, Tortimer will still give the villager a Chinese New Year shirt that corresponds to whatever the animal of that Chinese year is. So in a way, it's interesting. It's like events hidden in between the years 2000 and 2008 that were never supposed to be really seen by anyone are still there, programmed into the game to function just like normal. When it came to the Chinese New Year shirt, we actually tried to recreate this by testing out time travel, and we couldn't actually get the shirt to spawn on Chinese New Year, which was February 5th, 2000. As it turns out, you had to have an online connection for this event to work, and that shut down in 2014, so we were kind of out of luck. Next, we can look to Animal Crossing New Leaf, which is very unique compared to a lot of the other games here on this list. First of all, when it comes to the time period that you can actually time travel in and out of, it's much more restrictive. You can't actually time travel into the past before the game even was released. So the only available years are 2012, which was the year Animal Crossing New Leaf released in Japan, and this game spans all the way to the year 2050. Now, if you spend New Year's in the year 2050, the game will just bring you back in time to 2012, much like how City Folk would revert you back. Now, this game did handle time traveling a whole lot differently. The pros and cons between time traveling was different. There were a lot of mitigations you could do to not have as severe side effects from time traveling. Like, for instance, doing the Beautiful Town Ordinance would make it so weeds wouldn't pop up as severely, which was really big if you wanted to time travel large distances. You could even bury your turnips in some cases to stop them from spoiling stealing, which might be something that existed for a while. And then both in this game and in City Folk, one I forgot to mention just a moment ago, you were still at risk of your grass deteriorating because it would deteriorate based on how many times you loaded in. So technically, if you jumped in time multiple times in one day, you could deteriorate your grass at a much faster rate than someone who was playing the game normally. Now, on the downside of things, unfortunately, with Animal Crossing New Leaf, they did add a lot of functionality to try to make the process of villagers just randomly moving out a little bit slower and less jarring than previous titles. So in Animal Crossing New Leaf, oftentimes if you had a villager that was thinking about moving away, you could catch them in conversation and they would maybe let you know. And at least at that point, you had a chance to maybe talk them out of it and get them to stay in your town. It didn't always work, but now there was at least some clues you would have before they started thinking about seriously moving, and you could try to change the course and prove things differently. It's a really cool new feature that they had added in for New Leaf, and by time traveling large chunks of time, you're essentially sacrificing this new feature, and you're at equal risk of losing your town villagers like you were in the previous titles for time traveling. If you don't care about what villagers you have yet, it's not that big of a deal, but if New Leaf was a game that you were able to care about your villagers for a little bit more because you could convince them to stay, you are at least giving up that feature and option to try to get them to stay longer by time traveling excessively. Okay, next let's turn to Animal Crossing Pocket Camp, because this one's really interesting and there were a lot of discussions online as to how time traveling could potentially work in Animal Crossing Pocket Camp. Now, what is interesting is the game is tied to your phone clock, so in a way you can time travel to change what time appears in the game, and that could affect things like whether it's day or night, which doesn't really play too much of a role in any of the things you do in Animal Crossing Pocket Camp, because the main game itself does run on a global timer that is like set separately from whatever's going on in your phone. So even if you tried to kind of force the game into thinking it was way further in the future or a couple days have passed so you don't have to wait around for customization or things to be built in the game. I don't fully remember how Pocket Camp works, to be honest. None of that really matters because the game actually knows what's going on, because you're required an internet connection and the game is connected to whatever clock is already predetermined for the new day to roll over in the Animal Crossing Pocket Camp universe itself. And last but certainly not least, we are greeted with Animal Crossing New Horizons, which many fans have probably pointed out this by now, but Animal Crossing New Horizons is actually surprisingly incredibly lax when it comes to repercussions for not playing the game for a very long time. Sure, you might get a couple of weeds popping up throughout your town, and some villagers might be like, hey, we haven't seen you in a ton of months, but outside of a few little things like that, the problems of not playing for a long time aren't that bad. You'll have messy hair for a second, and you gotta clean it. And of course, the cockroaches, which I haven't really mentioned yet in this video, but are a feature in every game if you haven't played in a long time, will be in your house, and you just have to step on them, and it takes like 2 minutes. But once again, those are also in New Horizons besides every other game, but really otherwise nothing changes too much on your island as far as extreme time traveling goes. If you travel back in time to a day that you've already played or a day that's already passed from when you've played, the game will think that you've played the game and you might not get the news at the beginning of the day, and sometimes the store will be similar to what already was in the store that day, and a few things might be delayed on when you're able to do things until another new day occurs afterwards, resetting the path of the future. But all of these little things are minimum at best and really easy to work around. Nowadays, villagers won't move out unless you explicitly give them permission to move out. So not only do you no longer have to risk losing your favorite villager if you aggressively time travel, but if you wanted a specific villager to move out, there's even time traveling techniques where you could figure out what day a villager wants to move out, then move the clock forward and then backwards to that day again and cycle through which villager wants to move out because of the way that the game's programmed to kind of pick a specific day for a villager to ask to move. So this has led people to be able to manipulate their towns into getting a specific villager out in favor of getting a new villager in. And then of course Nintendo to try to put at least one more barrier to discourage massive time traveling. At least when Animal Crossing New Horizons initially released, they put seasonal items out of the game at launch and only would add them in when the season was approaching. This wasn't the case for everything in the game, but at least many of the items that were added on incrementally when seasons released were kind of locked to a certain date that if you time traveled to the date before the update came out, you wouldn't get the specific thing. Earth Day is a great example of this, as well, as it was like an actual event that had a period of time available to do it. It was only accessible after Nintendo put the update in the game that added all of that stuff. Was it called Earth Day? It might have been called Nature Day or some other day. I don't remember. It's on the screen, whatever it's called right now. Now, as far as time traveling goes, manipulating the Nintendo Switch's internal clock is really interesting, and there are some interesting findings that players have figured out with changing around the clock on the Nintendo Switch. GameSam somehow managed to find a way to make his Nintendo Switch think it was the year 1999 during New Year's, which was really interesting, and celebrated the year 2000 over on his Animal Crossing New Horizons channel. Make sure you guys check out GameSam. He does a ton of like what if scenarios along with some interesting concept scenarios as well. And then another Animal Crossing content creator, Popendo, figured out that you could time travel as far as the year 2060 in Animal Crossing New Horizons, and on New Year's Eve 2060, the clock will roll over to 2061, and you can spend a final day in 2061. However, when you try to load in a time outside of this window of the year 2000 or maybe late 1999 to 2061, the game will actually just straight up restrict you with a message saying that you're trying to play outside of an eligible time to play the game, and it gives you instructions on how to go into the settings and fix your clock back to the time where you're supposed to actually play the game. So essentially, a day could come where in Animal Crossing New Horizons, we all are too far in the future and have to purposely time travel back in time if we wanted to play the game on a real-time clock scenario. So that's kind of interesting in itself, especially since New Horizons is so strict about that regard of the game. But that's kind of how time and time travel in Animal Crossing has evolved over the years. What are your thoughts on time traveling? Are you all for it, full game, go for it? Or do you like to take a more relaxed approach going day by day, or a hybrid, kind of like how I said I do things, I guess? Let us know what you think in the comments down below. Make sure you are subscribed and notifications on for more videos like this. That's it for today, though. We'll see you all next time with a brand new video.